You know, when you think of 1930s Europe, you've probably got images of black-shirted fascists marching through Rome or Berlin, right? But what about London? It sounds kind of crazy, but for a while there, Britain actually had a homegrown fascist movement. So let's unpack that forgotten chapter of history.
Yeah, I know. It seems almost unbelievable, doesn't it? A fascist party, right in the heart of British democracy? But it was very, very real. And this wasn't just some fringe group with a handful of people. We're talking about an organized political movement with thousands of members. And they called themselves the British Union of Fascists, or the BUF for short. Their leader, a pretty charismatic and, well, controversial politician named Oswald Mosley. And under his command, they totally adopted the whole look. The black shirts, the dramatic rallies, and that authoritarian ideology that was sweeping across the rest of Europe.
Okay, so let's start by digging into what this movement was really all about. Who were Britain's black shirts? What did they actually believe? And, did they ever pose a real threat to the country's future? So you have to remember, this was during the Great Depression, a time of total turmoil, and the BUF comes along offering this radical new vision for Britain. So the big question is, what did they actually want to do?
At the absolute core of their entire political program was this idea they called the corporate state. Basically, the goal was to get rid of all rival political parties and let one single strong leader direct the entire economy. It was all about the state's interests coming first, always, and individual interests, well, they came in a distant second.
Beyond that big idea, their platform had a few other key parts. They wanted a parliament made up of experts from different industries, not politicians who were just elected by whatever area they lived in. They promised order and discipline, which really meant strict social control. And when it came to the rest of the world, they were total isolationists. They argued Britain should just focus on its own empire and stay out of everybody else's business.
Of course, you can't really talk about the BUF without bringing up their infamous German counterparts. And putting them side by side, it reveals not just some crucial similarities, but maybe even more importantly, some really crucial differences.
So, how do they stack up? Were the BUF basically just a British copy of the Nazis, or was there something fundamentally different going on with them?
Well, on the surface, the family resemblance is undeniable. I mean, both were authoritarian, intensely nationalistic, and fiercely anti-communist. They both used dramatic propaganda, huge rallies, and uniformed paramilitaries, the black shirts in Britain, the brown shirts in Germany, to project this image of strength and to intimidate their opponents. And as we just saw, both were pushing these corporatist economic ideas.
But, and this is a huge but, here's where they really split. It's a massive difference. Now, the BUF was definitely anti-Semitic, especially as time went on, but that prejudice wasn't the absolute, foundational core of their ideology. For the Nazis, though, that virulent, obsessive anti-Semitism and the belief in Aryan racial supremacy, that was everything. It was the central, organizing principle of their entire worldview, and it led directly to the absolute horrors of the Holocaust.
And as you can imagine, these deep ideological differences led to completely different outcomes. The Nazis, well, they seized total power and plunged the entire world into war. The BUF, on the other hand, they never really left the political French, pushing for isolationism as their influence just sort of faded away.
And at the end of the day, for any political movement, the real test is whether you can win power and actually implement your vision. And by that measure, the story of the BUF is a story of complete and utter failure.
Just look at this number. 0. That's how many seats the British Union of Fascists ever won in the British Parliament. Not a single one. Despite all the noise, all the marches, all the rallies, they gained absolutely no real political traction whatsoever.
And their membership numbers tell a pretty similar story of scale. At its absolute peak, the BUF had around 50,000 members, which, okay, sounds like a lot, until you see that the Nazi Party counted its members in the millions. The BUF was a puddle, the Nazi Party was an ocean.
So that brings us to the big question, right? Why? Why did fascism manage to take root and completely conquer Germany, while it just withered on the vine in Britain? What was the difference?
The BUF's collapse really happened in 4 key stages. First, they were totally rejected by voters. Then they were opposed by the public. After that, they were banned by the government. And finally, their leader was thrown in jail.
That second point, public opposition, is so critical. A perfect example is the famous Battle of Cable Street back in 1936.
So the BUF tried to march through a mostly Jewish area of East London, but they were met by tens of thousands of anti-fascist protesters. We're talking local residents, trade unionists, communists, socialists, who literally blocked their path and forced them to turn back.
And I think this contrast just sums it up perfectly. While the Nazis suppressed dissent to seize control, the BUF was suppressed by dissent. The opposition in Britain was just too strong, too vibrant, and too widespread for them to ever overcome.
And that leaves us with a final, really important question to think about. This whole forgotten chapter of British history isn't just some weird curiosity. It's a case study, really. It forces us to ask, what are the ingredients that make a democratic society resilient enough to resist the pull of extremism, even in the worst of times?